Story 1. The Repeating Mile Marker. Derek Hamill had been driving commercial routes through Montana for 11 years, and he prided himself on knowing every shortcut, every rest stop, and every reliable diner between Billings and Missoula. At 43 years old, he'd logged over 1 million miles without a single accident, and his spotless safety record had earned him the respect of every dispatcher at Frontier Freight Lines. On the night of September 14, 2019, he was hauling refrigerated pharmaceuticals along Highway 287, a route he'd driven at least 200 times before. The load was time-sensitive, but not particularly difficult, and Derek had planned to make his delivery window with 3 hours to spare. Around 10:47 p.m., just north of Townsend, Derek noticed his fuel gauge dropping faster than it should. He wasn't concerned. There was a truck stop about 30 miles ahead, where he regularly filled up. But when his GPS started glitching, showing his location jumping erratically across the map, he decided to take County Road 518, a back road shortcut he'd used dozens of times that would save him 15 minutes. The road was narrow, but well-maintained, cutting through dense pine forest, with virtually no traffic after dark. Derek had his CB radio on, listening to the occasional chatter from other truckers on the main highway, and he had his thermos of coffee wedged into the cup holder beside him. The first thing Derek noticed was the mile marker. It read, Mile 23, in the standard reflective green lettering, illuminated briefly in his headlights before disappearing into the darkness behind him. He didn't think much of it. Mile markers were just reference points. But 3 miles later, according to his odometer, he saw another mile marker. It also read, Mile 23. Derek frowned, assuming the first one had been vandalized or replaced incorrectly. He'd seen stranger things on back roads. County maintenance crews sometimes made mistakes, especially on routes that saw minimal traffic. He continued driving, watching the odometer tick upward. The road looked exactly as it always did. The same gentle curves, the same dense tree line pressing in from both sides, the same gravel turnoffs appearing at regular intervals. His headlights cut through the darkness, catching the occasional reflection of animal eyes in the underbrush. The yellow center line had faded in places, as it always had on this particular stretch. Everything seemed normal, except for the mile markers. At what should have been mile 26, Derek saw it again. Mile 23. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. He checked his odometer. He'd definitely traveled 6 miles since the first marker. He grabbed his CB radio and keyed the mic. This is Frontier 7. Anybody out there familiar with County Road 518 north of Townsend? Static answered him. He tried again, adjusting the frequency. Nothing. That was unusual, but not impossible. These back roads sometimes had dead zones for radio, signals. Derek kept driving, his eyes now fixed on watching for the next mile marker. His truck's engine hummed steadily, the refrigeration unit maintaining its constant 40-degree temperature in the trailer behind him. The dashboard clock read 11:03 p.m. When the next marker appeared, his stomach dropped. Mile 23. He'd now traveled 9 miles, and every marker read exactly the same. He pulled over onto one of the gravel turnoffs, shifted into park, and sat there with the engine idling. The forest around him was completely silent. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing. He pulled out his cell phone. No signal. The GPS was still malfunctioning, showing his location as a blank gray screen. Derek had encountered technical problems before, but never everything failing simultaneously. He considered turning around, but the road was too narrow for a full turnaround with his trailer, and backing up for miles in the darkness seemed more dangerous than continuing forward. Derek put the truck back in gear and continued. He started counting in his head, maintaining a steady 50 miles per hour. Every 3.5 minutes, a mile marker should appear. And every 3.5 minutes, it did, always reading mile 23. After the 8th identical marker, Derek's professionalism began cracking. He'd been on this road for over 30 minutes now, which meant he should have reached the highway intersection long ago. The road should have ended, but it just kept going, endlessly the same. At marker number 12, Derek noticed something else. The trees on his right side, a distinctive cluster of 3 white birches growing close together. He'd seen them before. Not just similar trees, but those exact trees, with the same unusual angle where one trunk bent sharply to the left. He slowed down, staring at them as he passed. 2 markers later, he saw them again. The exact same trees, in the exact same configuration. Panic started rising in his chest. Derek had heard stories from other truckers, urban legends about haunted highways and supernatural occurrences. He'd always dismissed them as bullshit, stories truckers told to pass the time. But this was happening to him, right now, and he had no rational explanation. He tried the CB radio again, cycling through every channel. On channel 19, he heard something. Not words, but a rhythmic static that sounded almost like breathing. He quickly changed channels. The temperature inside the cab seemed to drop. Derek turned up the heat, but it didn't help. His breath started fogging in the air. The refrigeration unit was behind him, separated by the cab's insulated wall. There was no reason for the temperature to plummet like this. He checked the thermometer on his dashboard. 51 degrees. That was impossible. The heater was running full blast. Mile marker 23 appeared again. Derek's odometer showed he'd traveled over 40 miles on this road. The entire length of County Road 518 was only 32 miles. He should have hit the highway intersection 20 minutes ago. Instead, he was trapped in some kind of loop, seeing the same markers, the same trees, the same curves over and over again. Then he saw something different. Standing beside the next mile marker was a figure. Derek's headlights illuminated it for just a moment as he approached. A person, wearing what looked like a trucker's jacket and cap, facing away from the road. Derek slammed on his brakes, the truck's air brakes hissing as he came to a stop about 50 feet past the marker. He sat there, breathing hard, staring into his side mirror. The figure was gone. Derek's hands were shaking now. He grabbed his flashlight from the door compartment and climbed down from the cab. The cold hit him immediately. It had to be below freezing, even though the September night should have been mild. He walked back toward the mile marker, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There was no one there. No footprints in the gravel beside the road. Nothing. But the mile marker itself looked different now. The paint seemed fresher, almost wet. And underneath the mile 23 designation, someone had scratched words into the metal. Derek leaned closer, his flashlight illuminating the crude lettering. "Turn back while you can." Derek ran back to his truck, his breath coming in short gasps. He climbed into the cab and locked the doors, his hands fumbling with the keys. He had to get out of here. He threw the truck into gear and accelerated, pushing the speed up to 60, then 70. The truck protested. These back roads weren't meant for high speeds, but he didn't care. He watched his odometer obsessively. 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, mile marker, 23. Derek screamed, slamming his fist against the steering wheel. The horn blared into the empty night. He kept driving, faster now, taking the curves recklessly. The trailer swayed behind him. 4 miles, 5 miles, 6 miles. Mile marker 23. 7 miles, 8 miles. Mile marker 23. The markers were appearing more frequently now, every 2 miles instead of every 3. Then every mile, then every half mile. The road ahead started looking different. The yellow center line was fading, becoming harder to see. The asphalt itself seemed to be deteriorating, cracks spreading across its surface like a spider's web. The trees on either side were pressing closer, branches reaching over the road, scraping against the top of his trailer. Derek ducked instinctively, even though he was safely inside the cab. Then suddenly, the road ended. Not at an intersection or highway junction. It just stopped. Derek's headlights illuminated a wall of trees where the road simply terminated, as if it had never gone any farther. He slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop just feet from the tree line. He sat there, engine idling, staring at the impossible sight in front of him. Behind him, he heard footsteps on gravel. Derek's eyes snapped to the side, mirror. Figures were approaching from the darkness, dozens of them, all wearing trucker jackets and caps, all walking with the same slow, deliberate pace. Their faces were wrong, too pale, too smooth, like mannequins. Derek threw the truck into reverse, but when he looked back, more figures were behind him, blocking his path. He was trapped. The figures surrounded the truck, pressing their hands against the metal, rocking it gently back and forth. Their mouths were moving, but Derek couldn't hear any sound. He grabbed his phone, still no signal. The CB radio, only that rhythmic static breathing. The temperature in the cab had dropped so low that ice was forming on the inside of the windows. Derek did the only thing he could think of. He closed his eyes and started reciting his daughter's phone number, over and over again. It was a touchstone, something real and concrete from his actual life. He thought about her birthday party last month, about his wife's terrible cooking, about the annoying rattle in his garage door that he kept meaning to fix. He focused on every mundane, ordinary detail he could remember, drowning out the horror surrounding him. When he opened his eyes, it was dawn. He was sitting in his truck in the parking lot of the truck stop north of Townsend, the one where he'd planned to refuel. Other truckers were moving around, filling their tanks, buying coffee. Everything was normal. Derek looked at his dashboard clock. 6:47 a.m. He'd lost 8 hours. His fuel tank was at a quarter full, consistent with the 30 miles he should have driven on County Road 518. The GPS was working perfectly. His phone had full signal. Derek delivered his load on time, but he never took County Road 518 again. He told the story once to another veteran trucker at a rest stop in Wyoming. The man had listened carefully, then nodded slowly. Mile 23, he'd said quietly. I've heard of it. Some roads don't want to let you go. Derek never spoke about it again, but he still has nightmares about mile markers, and he always takes the main highway now, no matter how much longer it takes. Story 2. The station that wasn't there. Marcus Webb had been driving for Transcontinental Logistics for 6 years, mostly running routes through the southwest desert regions. At 31, he was younger than most long-haul drivers, but he'd inherited his father's love of the road and his mother's practical approach to life. On March 22, 2021, Marcus was hauling auto parts from Phoenix to Albuquerque, a route that normally took him straight up Interstate 17 and across Interstate 40. But construction delays had backed up traffic for miles, and his dispatcher had suggested an alternate route through Nevada that would add only an hour to his trip while avoiding the worst of the congestion. The route took Marcus north through small desert towns, then east on Highway 93. By the time he reached the truly remote stretches, it was past midnight. The desert landscape was beautiful in its desolation. Vast stretches of scrubland punctuated by distant mountains. The sky so clear that the stars looked like scattered diamonds. Marcus had his window cracked, letting in the cool night air, and classic rock playing on his satellite radio. He'd made good time despite the detour, and he was actually ahead of schedule. Around 1:30 a.m., his fuel warning light came on. Marcus checked his gauge, a quarter tank left, enough for maybe 70 miles. His GPS showed the next town, Silver Creek, was 43 miles ahead. He'd refuel there and still make his delivery window with time to spare. He knew from experience that desert towns often had 24-hour truck stops, catering to the steady stream of commercial traffic that passed through on the highways. The road was completely empty. Marcus hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. The monotony of the drive was hypnotic. The same flat desert, stretching endlessly in all directions. The same distant mountains on the horizon. The same straight road disappearing into darkness ahead of him. He finished his energy drink and tossed the can into the passenger side trash bag. 30 minutes later, his GPS announced he was 5 miles from Silver Creek. Marcus sat up straighter, watching for the first lights of the town. But when the GPS indicated he'd arrived, there was nothing. Just more empty desert. No lights, no buildings, no town. Marcus pulled over, confused. He zoomed out on the GPS map. Silver Creek was clearly marked, but there was no physical evidence of any settlement. He'd heard of ghost towns in the desert, but those were still visible. Abandoned buildings, old signs, something. This was just empty land. His fuel gauge was now critically low. The warning chime was dinging insistently. Marcus consulted his GPS again. The next town was Caliente, 97 miles away. He didn't have 97 miles of fuel. He tried his phone, 1 bar of signal, but enough to do a search. Nothing came up for Silver Creek, Nevada. No gas stations, no truck stops, no town at all. It was as if the place his GPS insisted existed had simply vanished. Marcus sat there trying to decide what to do. He could call his dispatcher, but what would he say? I'm lost in the desert because I trusted my GPS. He'd never live it down. He could call for a tow truck, but that would take hours and cost a fortune. Or he could continue driving, hoping to find some hidden truck stop or emergency fuel depot. The desert was full of small operations that didn't show up on maps. He chose to keep driving. As his fuel gauge dropped closer to empty, Marcus felt his anxiety rising. The desert at night was beautiful, but hostile. If he ran out of fuel out here, he'd be stranded until morning, possibly longer. The temperature would drop into the 40s. He had emergency supplies, water, blankets, flares, but the prospect of spending hours alone in the dark desert was deeply unappealing. Then, like a miracle, he saw lights ahead. Marcus leaned forward, hardly believing it. A gas station, brightly lit, sitting alone on the right side of the highway. The sign read, Desert Star Travel Plaza, in red neon letters. There was a large truck parking area, several fuel pumps, and what looked like a convenience store. Marcus could have cried with relief. He signaled and pulled into the parking lot, even though there was no other traffic to signal to. The place looked modern and well-maintained, which was unusual for such a remote location. Usually these isolated desert stops were run down, barely hanging on financially. But Desert Star looked almost new. Fresh paint, clean windows, bright lighting. There were no other vehicles in the lot, but at this hour, that wasn't particularly surprising. Marcus pulled up to the diesel pumps. and shut off his engine. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus climbed down from his cab, his boots crunching on the clean pavement. Now that he was out of the truck, he could see the place more clearly. The convenience store had large windows, and through them, he could see fully stocked shelves, a coffee station, a hot food display. The lights were on, but he didn't see anyone inside. The front door had an open sign glowing in neon green. Marcus approached one of the diesel pumps and pulled out his company fuel card. The pump's display lit up when he touched it, showing current diesel prices that seemed reasonable. He selected his grade, authorized the transaction with his card, and started filling his tank. The pump worked perfectly, the numbers rolling steadily upward. As he waited, Marcus looked around the empty parking lot. In the distance, he could see the faint lights of what might have been other buildings. Perhaps this was actually the outskirts of a town his GPS had mislabeled. When the tank was full, Marcus replaced the nozzle and walked toward the convenience store. He wanted to use the restroom and grab some coffee for the road. As he approached the glass door, he saw his reflection, tired-looking, needing a shave, his company jacket slightly wrinkled. He pulled the door open. A small bell chimed. Inside, the store was immaculate. The floors were spotless, the shelves perfectly organized. The fluorescent lighting was almost too bright after the darkness outside. But there was no one behind the counter. "Hello?" Marcus called out. His voice echoed strangely in the empty space. He waited. No response. Marcus walked down the main aisle toward the restrooms in the back. Everything looked normal. Chips, candy, beef jerky, energy drinks, all the standard truck stop inventory. But something felt wrong. The products all looked slightly off, like generic versions of familiar brands. The chip bags had labels that said potato chips instead of Lay's or Doritos. The candy bars were labeled simply as chocolate bar or peanut candy. Even the soda bottles just said cola or lemon lime. Soda. The restroom door was marked with a simple stick figure. Marcus pushed it open and found a clean, well-lit bathroom with modern fixtures. He used the facilities, washed his hands, and stared at himself in the mirror. He looked exhausted. This detour had taken more out of him than he'd realized. As he dried his hands with paper towels from a dispenser, labeled simply paper towels, he heard the bell chime from the front door. Relief washed over him. The attendant must have been outside or in a back office. Marcus left the restroom and headed toward the front of the store. "Hey, sorry," he called out. "I already pumped my fuel and used the bathroom. Hope that's okay." But when he reached the counter area, there was no one there. The store was still empty. Marcus felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He'd clearly heard the door chime. He walked to the front windows and looked out at the parking lot. No one. His truck sat alone under the bright lights, his only company in this impossibly isolated place. Marcus decided to leave. He could go without the coffee. But as he reached for the door handle, he glanced at the counter. There was a clipboard lying there with what looked like a sign-in sheet. Curious, despite his growing unease, Marcus picked it up. The page had 3 columns: name, vehicle, and time. There were dozens of entries, all written in different handwriting. Marcus scanned the list, his eyes stopping on one entry that made his blood run cold. Derek Hamill, Frontier Freight Lines, 11:17 p.m. The date written next to it was September 14th, 2019. Marcus remembered that name from a story another trucker had told him at a rest stop last year. A guy who'd gotten lost on some back road in Montana, trapped in a loop driving past the same mile marker over and over. Marcus had assumed it was just a story. But here was the name, written in what looked like genuine cursive handwriting. And below it were more names, dozens of them, stretching back across multiple pages, clipped to the board. Different dates, different locations, but all truckers or commercial drivers. The most recent entry before tonight was dated February 3rd, 2021, less than 2 months ago. The name was Jennifer Ortega, Rocky Mountain Logistics, 2:43 a.m. Marcus dropped the clipboard like it was burning him. He yanked open the door and ran back to his truck, his heart pounding. The bell chimed behind him, sounding almost mocking. He climbed into his cab, started the engine, and threw the truck into gear. As he pulled back onto the highway, he looked in his side mirror. The Desert Star Travel Plaza was still there, brightly lit, the open sign glowing cheerfully in the darkness. Marcus drove for 2 hours straight, refusing to stop, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. He watched his fuel gauge obsessively. It showed 3/4 full, consistent with having just refueled. Everything seemed normal. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had almost happened back at that gas station, something he'd narrowly escaped by running when he did. When he finally reached Caliente, a real town, with real people and real businesses, Marcus pulled into an actual truck stop and sat in his cab shaking. He checked his fuel receipt from the Desert Star. The transaction had gone through on his company card, charging $347.82 for 113.4 gallons of diesel. The fuel was real. The station had been real. But something about it was fundamentally wrong. Marcus reported the incident to his company, framing it as a concern about an unauthorized travel plaza operating without proper signage. The company investigated and found no record of any business called Desert Star Travel Plaza anywhere in Nevada. The location Marcus had marked on his GPS showed only empty desert, no structures, no evidence that anything had ever been built there. But the fuel charge was real and accounted for. 3 months later, Marcus was having drinks with another driver who mentioned a weird experience at an isolated gas station in Nevada. Before the other driver could finish his story, Marcus interrupted him. Desert Star Travel Plaza. The other driver's face went pale. How did you know? They compared notes. The other driver had been there in 2019. He'd seen the same generic products, experienced the same absence of staff, found the same clipboard. Marcus now carries a list of emergency fuel stops programmed into a secondary GPS unit, all verified and cross-referenced with other drivers. He never deviates from main highways anymore, even in construction zones. And he keeps the fuel receipt from Desert Star in his wallet, partly as proof that he's not crazy, and partly as a reminder that some places exist in between, not quite real, not quite imaginary, waiting in the empty desert darkness for travelers who run low on fuel and have nowhere else to turn. He still doesn't know what would have happened if he'd signed that clipboard. Story 3. The passenger who wasn't invited. Elena Vasquez had been driving her own rig for 3 years after spending 2 years as a company driver learning the ropes. At 28, she owned a well-maintained Peterbilt 5M9 and ran her own small operation, contracted primarily through freight brokers who supplied her with steady work. She specialized in time-sensitive deliveries, willing to drive odd hours and difficult routes that other owner-operators often refused. On November 8, 2020, Elena picked up a load of electronics in Sacramento, bound for a distribution center in Boise, Idaho. The route would take her northeast through California, up through Nevada, and into Idaho. About 11 hours of driving if she pushed through with minimal stops. Elena left Sacramento at 7:00 p.m., planning to drive through the night and arrive in Boise by mid-morning. She preferred night driving, less traffic, cooler temperatures, and a peaceful quality to the empty highways. That helped her think. She had her favorite playlist loaded, her coffee thermos full, and a bag of snacks within reach. The weather was clear, the truck was running perfectly, and Elena felt confident about making the delivery window with time to spare. Around 11:30 p.m., Elena was driving through northeastern Nevada on Highway 93, a long stretch of road that cut through vast expanses of high desert. The landscape was austere and beautiful, rolling hills dotted with sagebrush, distant mountains silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Traffic was virtually non-existent. Elena hadn't seen another vehicle in over 30 minutes. The silence and isolation were exactly what she loved about night driving. Just her, the road, and her thoughts. She was approaching the small town of Wells, Nevada, when she saw someone standing on the shoulder of the road. Elena's headlights illuminated the figure from about a quarter-mile away. A woman wearing a light-colored dress, holding her thumb out in the universal gesture for hitchhiking. Elena's first instinct was to ignore her. She never picked up hitchhikers, a rule drilled into her by every veteran trucker she'd ever met. But as she got closer, something made her hesitate. The woman looked young, maybe early 20s, and she seemed distressed. Even from inside her cab, Elena could see that the dress was torn and dirty, and the woman's long, dark hair was disheveled. There was no car nearby, no indication of how this person had ended up alone on the side of a highway in the middle of the night, miles from anywhere. Elena knew she should keep driving, but her conscience wouldn't let her. What if this woman had been in an accident? What if she was hurt and needed help? Elena slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder about 50 feet past the woman. She left the engine running and grabbed her phone, making sure it was easily accessible. Through her side mirror, she watched the woman start walking toward the truck. Even her walk seemed off, too smooth, almost gliding. Elena felt her instinct screaming at her to just drive away, but she'd already stopped. The woman reached the passenger side and looked up at Elena through the window. Her face was pale, almost luminous in the darkness, with large, dark eyes that seemed to take up too much space. She smiled, and it was the most unsettling smile Elena had ever seen, too wide, revealing too many teeth. "Thank you for stopping," the woman said, her voice muffled through the glass but audible. "I've been waiting so long." Every instinct Elena had was telling her this was wrong, but she couldn't articulate why. The woman looked human, sounded human. Maybe she was just in shock from whatever had happened to her. Elena cracked the window open slightly. "Are you okay? Do you need me to call someone?" "I just need a ride," the woman said. "Just up the road a bit. It's not far." Elena hesitated. "I don't normally pick up passengers. This is a commercial vehicle. Please." The woman's smile never wavered. "I've been waiting so long for someone to stop. You're the first person to show kindness." Elena made a decision she would regret. She unlocked the passenger door. "Okay, but I can't take you far. I'm on a schedule." The woman climbed into the cab with surprising agility, settling into the passenger seat. Up close, Elena could see that the dress wasn't just torn. It looked old, decades old, with a style that might have been fashionable in the 1960s or 70s. But the fabric looked almost new, despite the tears. "Thank you," the woman said again. "You're very kind." Elena put the truck back in gear and pulled onto the highway. The woman sat motionless in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap. staring straight ahead. Elena glanced at her several times, trying to think of something to say. "What's your name?" she finally asked. "Sarah." The response came immediately, but the woman's lips barely moved. "I'm Sarah." "I'm Elena. So, Sarah, what happened? How did you end up out here?" "There was an accident," Sarah said, still staring straight ahead. "A long time ago. I've been waiting ever since." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. "A long time ago? What do you mean? When?" 1973, Sarah said. "July 19th, 1973. Elena's hands tightened on the steering wheel. This was impossible. This woman couldn't be more than 25 years old. If what she was saying was true, she'd be over 70 by now. Elena's mind raced through possibilities. Maybe Sarah was mentally ill. Maybe she was confused. Maybe this was some kind of drug-induced delusion. But the specific date, the calm delivery, something was very wrong. "Sarah, that doesn't make sense. That was almost 50 years ago." "Was it?" Sarah turned to look at Elena for the first time since getting in the truck, and Elena had to force herself not to flinch. Sarah's eyes were completely black, not dark brown, but actual black, like pools of ink. Time moves differently when you're waiting. Elena's heart was pounding now. She wanted this woman out of her truck immediately, but they were still in the middle of nowhere. The next town was Wells, still 10 miles away. She decided to play along, to keep things calm, until she could reach civilization and get help. "Where do you need to go, Sarah?" "To the place where it happened," Sarah said. "You'll know it when you see it." They drove in silence for several minutes. Elena kept glancing at Sarah, who sat perfectly still, not blinking, barely breathing. Elena's phone was in the center console, easily within reach. She thought about calling 911, but what would she say? She'd picked up a hitchhiker who claimed to be a ghost. They'd think she was the crazy one. Then Sarah started humming. It was a tune Elena didn't recognize, something old and melancholic. The sound seemed to fill the entire cab, reverberating off the windows and metal surfaces. Elena reached over and turned on the radio, trying to drown out the humming. Static blasted from the speakers, punctuated by strange clicking sounds that almost formed a pattern. She tried different stations, all static. Even her satellite radio, which should have worked anywhere, produced only that same clicking static. "Turn it off," Sarah said quietly. "I don't like the noise." Elena turned off the radio. Sarah's humming continued, growing slightly louder. Elena noticed that the temperature in the cab had dropped dramatically. She turned up the heat, but it didn't help. Her breath was fogging in the air now, and she could see condensation forming on the inside of the windows. The dashboard thermometer read 72 degrees, but it felt like it was below freezing. "Sarah, I think you need medical help," Elena said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm going to take you to a hospital in Wells, okay?" "We're almost there," Sarah said, ignoring Elena's suggestion. "Slow down. It's just ahead." Elena didn't see anything ahead, except more empty highway, but she began to slow down. As she did, her headlights illuminated something on the right side of the road. A small cross, the kind people put up to mark where someone died in an accident. It was old and weathered, with faded plastic flowers tied to it, with sun-bleached ribbon. "There," Sarah said. "Stop there." Elena pulled onto the shoulder, her emergency flashes automatically activating. The cross was clearly very old, the wood gray and splintered. As her headlights fell on it, Elena could make out a small metal plaque attached to the base. She couldn't read it from inside the cab, but she felt a growing sense of dread about what it might say. "Thank you for bringing me home," Sarah said. She turned to look at Elena one more time, and her smile was different now. Sad, resigned. "Be careful on these roads, Elena. There are so many of us waiting. So many who never made it home." "Sarah, wait," Elena began, but when she looked at the passenger seat, it was empty. The door hadn't opened. There had been no sound of movement. Sarah was simply gone. Elena sat there, her heart racing, staring at the empty seat. The cab was still freezing cold, and the windows were covered with frost on the inside. But she was alone. Elena grabbed her flashlight and climbed down from the cab, her legs shaking. She had to know. She walked to the cross, directing her flashlight at the metal plaque. The engraving was worn but still legible. Sarah Michelle Harmon, July 19th, 1973. Age 23. Forever in our hearts. Elena ran back to her truck and drove away, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the steering wheel. She didn't stop until she reached a busy truck stop outside of Wells, where she parked under bright lights surrounded by other trucks and real, living people. She sat in her cab for an hour, drinking coffee, trying to process what had happened. The passenger seat looked normal now, no sign that anyone had been sitting there. The ET temperature had returned to normal. But when Elena checked her security camera, a dashboard cam she kept running during all drives, the recording showed something that made her blood run cold. The footage clearly showed her stopping, pulling onto the shoulder beside what looked like a person. It showed her passenger door opening by itself. And then, for the next 20 minutes, the footage showed Elena having an animated conversation with an empty seat, gesturing and speaking to thin air. On the recording, there was no Sarah. There had never been anyone there. Elena completed her delivery to Boise, but she drove straight through without stopping, even though she was exhausted and shaken. She reported a strange experience to her dispatcher, but didn't go into details. She knew how it would sound. Over the following weeks, Elena researched the accident. Sarah Michelle Harmon had been driving to meet her fiancé in Elko, Nevada, when her car was struck by a drunk driver. She died instantly on July 19th, 1973, on Highway 93, at the exact location where Elena had picked her up 47 years later. Elena still drives at night, still takes the difficult routes, but she never stops for hitchhikers anymore, no matter what. She's heard from other truckers who've had similar experiences on that stretch of highway. Always a young woman in an old-fashioned dress, always asking for a ride, always directing drivers to that same roadside memorial. Elena doesn't know why Sarah appeared to her that night, or why she was allowed to see what others couldn't. But she knows that some passengers don't need an invitation, and some rides don't end when you reach the destination. She's had the passenger seat professionally cleaned 3 times, but on cold nights, she can still sometimes see frost forming on the empty seat beside her, and she swears she can hear faint humming over the sound of the engine. Story 4. The Town That Changed. Robert Chen had been driving for Pacific Northwest Freight for 9 years, primarily running routes between Seattle and various cities throughout Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. At 47, he was methodical and careful, known for his reliability and his habit of keeping detailed logs of his drives. On February 15, 2018, Robert was hauling fresh seafood from Seattle to a restaurant distributor in Spokane. The load was refrigerated and time-sensitive, but the weather was good, and Robert had made this exact run at least 50 times before. He knew every mile of Interstate 90, every rest stop, every reliable fuel station. Around 9 p.m., Robert was driving through central Washington when he encountered unexpected road construction. The highway was closed for emergency repairs following a landslide, and traffic was being diverted onto a state route that would add approximately 40 minutes to his trip. Robert wasn't particularly concerned. He'd built cushion time into his schedule for exactly these kinds of situations. He followed the detour signs onto Highway 821, a scenic route that ran parallel to the interstate through a river valley. The highway was narrow but well maintained, cutting through pine forests and alongside the Yakima River. Robert had never driven this particular route before, but his GPS showed it clearly, and the detour was properly marked with official Department of Transportation signs. The moon was full, casting silver light across the landscape and making the river shimmer beside the road. Robert actually enjoyed the change of scenery from his usual route. About 30 minutes into the detour, Robert saw lights ahead, a small town nestled in the valley. His GPS identified it as Cedar Falls, population 1,847. Robert didn't remember hearing of Cedar Falls before, but that wasn't unusual. Washington had dozens of small towns scattered throughout its rural areas, many of which he'd never visited. As he approached the town limits, he saw a standard green highway sign, Cedar Falls, population 1,847, founded 1889. The town looked quaint and well-preserved, with the kind of classic Pacific Northwest architecture that suggested it had been a logging or mining community back in the late 1800s. Main Street had old-fashioned street lamps that gave the downtown area a warm, inviting glow. Robert could see a gas station, a diner, a general store, and several other small businesses. A few people were walking along the sidewalks, and there were cars parked along the street. Everything looked completely normal. Robert noticed his fuel gauge was at half tank. Not critical, but he'd been planning to refuel soon anyway. The gas station looked open, so he decided to stop. It would give him a chance to use the restroom and grab a fresh coffee for the rest of the drive. He pulled into the station, a charming place with old-fashioned pumps that had been restored to look vintage while clearly being modern equipment. The attached convenience store had a hand-painted sign reading Cedar Falls Trading Post, Esto 1892. Robert filled his tank and went inside to pay. The store was exactly what he expected, clean, well-stocked with local products and typical convenience store items, with wood paneling and vintage decorations that gave it a nostalgic feel. An elderly man stood behind the counter, wearing a flannel shirt and a welcoming smile. "Evening," he said. "Just the fuel." "And a large coffee if you've got it fresh," Robert replied. "Brewed it 20 minutes ago," the man said. "Traveling through?" "Yeah, delivering to Spokane. Detour brought me this way. Didn't know this town was here." The man nodded, ringing up the transaction. "Most folks don't, unless they take the scenic route. We like it that way. Keeps things peaceful." Robert paid with his company card, grabbed his coffee, and chatted briefly about the weather before heading back to his truck. The coffee was excellent, actually. Rich and strong, better than the typical truck stop brew. As Robert pulled back onto the highway and drove through the rest of Cedar Falls, he noticed more details. The town had a small park with a gazebo, a white church with a tall steeple, a brick building that appeared to be the town hall, and several blocks of residential homes with well-maintained yards. Children's bikes were visible on some porches, and Christmas decorations were still up on many houses, even though it was mid-February. It all seemed so normal, so lived in and real. Robert's GPS showed that the detour would connect back to Interstate 90 in another 15 miles. He sipped his coffee, made a mental note that Cedar Falls was a pleasant place to stop if he ever took this route again, and continued driving. The rest of the trip to Spokane was uneventful. He delivered his load on time, got some sleep at a hotel, and picked up his return load the next morning. The drive back to Seattle took him on Interstate 90. The landslide had been cleared, and traffic was flowing normally. Robert didn't think much about Cedar Falls until 2 weeks later, when he was talking with another driver who regularly ran routes through central Washington. Robert mentioned the detour and the pleasant little town where he'd stopped for fuel. "Cedar Falls?" the other driver said, looking confused. "Never heard of it. Where exactly was it?" Robert pulled out his GPS and showed him. "Right here, on Highway 821, about 30 miles from the interstate detour point." The other driver zoomed in on his own GPS. "Bob, there's nothing there. No town, no gas station, nothing. Just forest and the river." Robert frowned. "That's impossible. I was there. I bought fuel and coffee. I've got the receipt." He pulled out his logbook, where he kept all his receipts organized by date. He found the receipt from Cedar Falls Trading Post, dated February 15th, showing a fuel purchase of $284.61 and a $3.50 coffee. The receipt even had the address, 127 Main Street, Cedar Falls, WA 98946. The other driver took the receipt and examined it. "This looks real, but I'm telling you, there's no Cedar Falls on Highway 821. I've driven that route 100 times. They spent several minutes looking at various maps and GPS systems. None of them showed Cedar Falls. Robert even did an internet search on his phone. Nothing came up. No website, no Wikipedia page, no mention of Cedar Falls anywhere in Washington state. Confused and more than a little disturbed, Robert decided to investigate. The following week, he specifically requested a route that would take him through that area. He told his dispatcher he wanted to check on something regarding a previous delivery. On February 22nd, exactly 1 week after his original trip, Robert drove back to Highway 821. He knew precisely where Cedar Falls should be. He'd marked the location in his GPS and had detailed notes about the mileage from the interstate turnoff. When Robert reached the location, there was nothing there. No town, no lights, no buildings. Just dense forest on one side of the road and the Yakima River on the other. Robert pulled over at the exact coordinates where Cedar Falls should have been. He got out of his truck with a flashlight and walked around. There was no evidence that a town had ever existed there. No foundations, no old roads, no historical markers, nothing. Just pristine forest that looked like it had never been disturbed. Robert stood there in the cold February night, his breath fogging in the air, staring at the empty landscape. He pulled out the receipt from his pocket and read it again under his flashlight. The receipt was absolutely real. He could feel the thermal paper, see the printed text, even smell the faint coffee stain where he'd set his cup down on it. But the town where he'd obtained this receipt had vanished, if it had ever really existed at all. Over the next several months, Robert became obsessed with Cedar Falls. He researched Washington state history, looking for any mention of a town by that name. He found references to several towns called Cedar Falls in other states, but none in Washington. He contacted the Washington State Historical Society, the Department of Transportation, and even local historians who specialized in small towns of the Pacific Northwest. Nobody had ever heard of Cedar Falls on Highway 821. Robert drove that route 7 more times over the course of 2018, always at different times of day and night, hoping to find the town again. He never did. The stretch of highway where Cedar Falls had been remained unchanged, just forest, river, and empty road. He talked to other truckers, asking if anyone had ever stopped in a small town on Highway 821. Most said no. But two drivers, when pressed, remembered something vague. A town they'd driven through once, years ago, that they couldn't quite recall the name of. When Robert showed them his receipt, both drivers went pale and said the town looked familiar, but they couldn't explain why. The receipt remained Robert's only physical evidence that Cedar Falls had existed. He had it professionally examined by a document analyst who confirmed it was genuine thermal paper receipt, consistent with receipts from 2018, showing no signs of forgery or manipulation. The fuel transaction had gone through on Robert's company card, and the charge was in the company records. Robert had really stopped somewhere and purchased fuel. But where? In October 2018, Robert was driving Highway 821 again. He'd practically worn a path on that route with his repeated trips, when he encountered another detour. This time it was for scheduled maintenance, and it took him onto a smaller county road that ran parallel to the highway. As he drove, Robert noticed an old historical marker, partially hidden by overgrown bushes. He stopped and investigated. The marker was weathered and damaged, barely readable, but Robert could make out some of the text. Site of Cedar Falls, founded 1889. Abandoned 1953. There was more text, but it was too eroded to read. Robert felt his heart racing. Cedar Falls had existed. It had been a real place, but it had been abandoned over 60 years ago. The historical marker didn't explain why the town had been abandoned or what had happened to it. Robert reported his findings to local historical societies, and eventually he connected with a retired historian who remembered hearing stories about Cedar Falls from his grandfather. According to the old stories, Cedar Falls had been abandoned suddenly in 1953 after a series of unexplained disappearances and strange occurrences. The entire population of over 1,800 people had left within a span of 6 months, leaving buildings and belongings behind. The state had eventually cleared the site and let the forest reclaim it, wanting to erase the memory of whatever had happened there. The historian couldn't provide specifics about what had driven people away, only that his grandfather had spoken of it with fear and refused to discuss details. The official records had been sealed or lost. It was as if someone had deliberately tried to erase Cedar Falls from history. But somehow, impossibly, Robert had driven through a living, functioning version of the town in 2018, 65 years after it should have ceased to exist. Robert still has the receipt, now laminated and stored in a safe deposit box along with his detailed notes and photographs of the historical marker. He's given up trying to convince people that he visited a town that doesn't exist. But he continues to drive Highway 821 whenever his routes take him through central Washington, always watching, always hoping to see those welcoming lights in the valley, that hand-painted sign welcoming him back to Cedar Falls. He doesn't know what he would do if he found it again. Drive through or turn around and leave, afraid of what might happen if he stopped a second time. Some places exist outside of normal time and space, slipping in and out of reality like fragments of a dream. And some travelers are unlucky enough, or perhaps lucky enough, to stumble into these places and return to tell the tale. Story 5. The Headlights That Followed. Jamal Thompson was a third-generation trucker, carrying on a family tradition that stretched back to his grandfather's days, driving for interstate freight companies in the 1960s. At 36, Jamal had been on the road professionally for 14 years, long enough to have seen almost everything the highways had to offer. On August 3, 2020, Jamal was hauling furniture from North Carolina to Texas, a straight shot west on Interstate 40 that would take him through Tennessee, Arkansas, and into the Lone Star State. The route was familiar. He'd driven it dozens of times, and the weather was perfect for long-distance driving. Jamal left Charlotte at 4 a.m., hoping to make it to Little Rock by nightfall. He was driving a well-maintained Kenworth W900, pulling a 48-foot dry van trailer loaded with office furniture and equipment. His truck was equipped with all the modern conveniences: satellite radio, advanced GPS, dash camera, and even a small television for his sleeping berth. Jamal prided himself on being a professional, and his truck reflected that commitment to quality. The day passed uneventfully. Jamal made good time through Tennessee and crossed into Arkansas around 6 p.m. He stopped briefly at a truck stop in Memphis for fuel and dinner, then continued west. By 10 p.m., he was driving through rural Arkansas on a relatively empty stretch of I-40. Traffic had thinned out considerably, and Jamal was making excellent time. He planned to drive for another 2 hours before stopping for the night at a truck stop outside Little Rock. Around 10:30 p.m., Jamal noticed headlights in his driver's side mirror. Another vehicle had pulled onto the highway from an entrance ramp, falling into position behind him at a distance of maybe 200 yards. Jamal didn't think much of it. Vehicles passed each other constantly on the interstate. He was maintaining a steady 65 miles per hour, and he expected the vehicle behind him to either pass or maintain its distance. But the vehicle didn't pass. It stayed behind him, maintaining the exact same distance. Jamal drove for 5 miles, then 10 miles, then 15 miles. The headlights remained in his mirror, never getting closer, never falling back, never attempting to pass. Jamal checked his speedometer. He was still at 65. He glanced at his mirrors. The headlights were positioned oddly, wider apart than normal car headlights, but at the wrong height for another truck. Maybe a wide-body pickup, or an older model SUV. After 20 miles, Jamal started feeling uncomfortable. The vehicle's behavior was strange enough to trigger his instincts. He decided to test whether the driver was deliberately following him. He slowed down to 60 miles per hour, watching his mirror carefully. The headlights also slowed, maintaining the same distance. Jamal sped up to 70. The headlights matched his speed exactly. He slowed to 55. The headlights did the same. Jamal felt his heart rate increasing. This wasn't normal highway driving. Someone was deliberately pacing him, matching his speed with unnatural precision. He tried to get a better look at the vehicle, but his mirrors only showed the headlights. The actual vehicle body was lost in the darkness behind the bright lights. The distance between them never varied by more than a few feet, as if the vehicle was somehow locked onto his truck. Jamal picked up his CB radio and keyed the mic. "This is Thompson Transport. Anybody out there running westbound on I-40 near mile marker 237? Static answered him. He tried again on different channels. "Hey, anybody copy? I've got a vehicle following me that's acting strange." More static. That was unusual. CB radios usually had at least some chatter, especially on the main channels. He decided to take the next exit, a rest area coming up in 3 miles. If the vehicle followed him off the highway, he'd know for certain something was wrong, and he could potentially get help from other truckers or call state police. As the rest area sign appeared in his headlights, Jamal signaled and moved into the exit lane. He watched his mirrors intently. The headlights behind him also signaled and followed him into the exit lane, maintaining that same precise distance. The rest area was moderately busy. Several trucks and cars were parked in the designated spots, and the facility building was lit up. Jamal pulled into the truck parking area, carefully maneuvering into a spot near the main building where there were other vehicles and people. He immediately looked in his mirrors to see what vehicle had been following him. But as he watched, the headlights simply stopped at the entrance to the parking area. They didn't pull in, didn't continue past. They just sat there, pointing directly at Jamal's truck. Jamal grabbed his phone and considered calling the police. But what would he say? A vehicle followed him off the highway and was now parked at the edge of a rest area. That wasn't illegal. Maybe the driver was just taking a break too. But something about those headlights felt malevolent, predatory. They seemed to be watching him, waiting for something. After 5 minutes of staring at each other, Jamal watching the headlights pointed at his truck, Jamal decided to get out and confront the situation. He climbed down from his cab and started walking toward the headlights. As he got closer, he could begin to make out the vehicle's shape. It was a car, something old and boxy, maybe from the 1970s or early 80s. The headlights were the old sealed beam style, which explained their unusual appearance. But he still couldn't see who was driving. The windshield reflected the parking lot lights in a way that made it impossible to see inside. When Jamal was about 50 feet away, the car's headlights suddenly switched to high beams, flooding him with light so bright he had to shield his eyes. He stopped, momentarily blinded. He heard the engine rev. It had a distinctive sound, like an old V8 with a damaged muffler. Then the car jerked backward, turned around with surprising speed, and drove back toward the highway exit. Within seconds, it was gone, the tail lights disappearing into the darkness. Jamal stood there, his heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. He looked around the rest area. A few other truckers were moving around, but none of them seemed to have noticed the incident. Jamal walked back to his truck, climbed inside, and locked the doors. He sat there for 20 minutes, drinking coffee from his thermos, trying to calm his nerves. Maybe it had been nothing. Maybe it was just some weird driver with unusual habits. He was probably overreacting. At 11:15 p.m., Jamal got back on the highway, continuing west toward Little Rock. His mirrors were clear, no vehicles behind him. Traffic was even lighter now, with only occasional cars and trucks visible in either direction. Jamal tried to relax, turning up his music and focusing on the road ahead. He had about 40 more miles to his planned stop for the night. 10 minutes later, headlights appeared in his mirror. The same headlights, with that distinctive wide spacing and slightly odd angle. The vehicle pulled onto the highway from nowhere. There hadn't been any entrance ramps for the last several miles, and fell into position exactly 200 yards behind Jamal's truck. The same distance as before, maintained with the same mechanical precision. Jamal's blood ran cold. This was impossible. He'd seen the vehicle drive away at the rest area. Even if the driver had turned around and come back, there was no way they could have caught up to him and gotten ahead to merge back onto the highway behind him. The mathematics didn't work. Unless the vehicle had somehow taken a parallel route and timed it perfectly, which seemed absurdly unlikely. Jamal grabbed his CB radio again. "Emergency, emergency. This is Thompson Transport on I-40 westbound. I'm being followed by an unknown vehicle showing aggressive behavior. Can anybody copy?" The static that answered him wasn't normal static. It had a rhythmic quality, almost like breathing. Jamal switched channels frantically, but every channel had the same breathing static. He looked at his phone. No signal. That shouldn't be possible on the interstate. He had a good carrier with coverage along all major highways. But the phone showed 0 bars, no data connection, nothing. His satellite radio suddenly cut out, replaced by that same rhythmic static. Even his truck's AM/FM radio, when he tried it, produced only the breathing static. The headlights in his mirror started flashing, bright, dark, in a rapid pattern that was almost hypnotic. Jamal forced himself to look away, focusing on the road ahead. He pushed his speed up to 75, then 80. His truck protested. It wasn't designed for high speeds with a full load, but Jamal didn't care. He had to get away from whatever was behind him. The headlights matched his speed exactly, the distance between them never changing. Jamal's speedometer hit 85. The truck was shaking now, the steering wheel vibrating in his hands. The headlights stayed locked on him. Jamal saw a sign for Little Rock, still 30 miles away. He didn't think he could push the truck much harder without risking a catastrophic mechanical failure or losing control. Then the headlights started getting closer. Slowly at first, then faster, closing the distance that had remained constant for so long. Jamal watched in horror as they approached. 150 yards, 100 yards, 50 yards. They were coming up fast now, faster than any normal vehicle should be able to accelerate. Jamal's speedometer was at 88 miles per hour, the absolute maximum his truck could safely handle, and the headlights were still gaining. When they were about 20 feet behind his trailer, close enough that Jamal could clearly see them filling his mirrors, something strange happened. The headlights suddenly split apart, one moving to the left side of his truck and one to the right, as if the vehicle had somehow divided in two. Jamal's mind couldn't process what he was seeing. The headlights were now parallel to his trailer on both sides, pacing him perfectly, boxing him in. Then they started moving forward, advancing alongside his truck. Jamal looked out his window to see what kind of vehicle could possibly be doing this. What he saw made him scream. There was no vehicle. The headlights were there, bright and solid, illuminating the road, but there was nothing behind them. No car body, no frame, no driver. Just the headlights themselves, floating in the darkness, moving independently alongside his truck. The headlights pulled even with his cab, and Jamal could feel the temperature inside his truck plummeting. The windshield started frosting over from the inside. His breath came out in visible clouds. The headlights on his left side were so close he could have reached out and touched them if there had been anything physical to touch. They seemed to study him, evaluating him, deciding something. Then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, they vanished. Both headlights simply blinked out of existence. The temperature in the cab immediately returned to normal. The static on all his radios cut off, replaced by normal broadcasts. His phone signal returned. Jamal checked all his mirrors frantically. Nothing behind him, nothing beside him, nothing ahead. The highway was completely empty in all directions. Jamal pulled over onto the shoulder, his whole body shaking. He sat there with the engine idling, trying to catch his breath, trying to convince himself that what had just happened was real. His dash camera had been recording the entire time. With trembling hands, Jamal pulled up the footage on his phone, connected via Bluetooth to the camera. He watched the entire sequence, the headlights appearing, following, pacing, splitting apart, advancing alongside his truck. But on the camera footage, the headlights looked normal, attached to what appeared to be a standard car that stayed at a normal distance. There was no split, no impossible maneuvering, no disembodied lights. The camera had recorded a completely different reality than what Jamal had experienced. Jamal drove the remaining distance to Little Rock at exactly 55 miles per hour, his hands clenched on the wheel, checking his mirrors every few seconds. He pulled into a large truck stop that was busy and well lit, parking his truck among dozens of others. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his cab with all the lights on, drinking coffee, watching the mirrors, waiting for dawn. The next morning, Jamal called his dispatcher and requested a different driver to complete the delivery to Texas. He drove his truck back to Charlotte instead, taking Interstate 40 the entire way during daylight hours, never stopping except at major truck stops with dozens of other people around. He never saw the headlights again, but he knows they're out there, following someone else now, matching speeds with mechanical precision, waiting for the moment to reveal their true nature. Jamal still drives commercially, but he plans his routes carefully now, avoiding night driving whenever possible, and he always keeps multiple vehicles around him on the highway. The idea of being alone on an empty stretch of road at night fills him with terror, because he knows that some things follow truckers on the highway, and some of those things aren't bound by the normal rules of physics or reality. They're just headlights in the darkness, watching, waiting, measuring the distance between hunter and prey. Story 6. The Alternate Route. Patricia Morrison had been driving for Transamerica Logistics for 12 years, making her one of the more experienced female drivers in the company's fleet. At 42, she'd carved out a successful career in a male-dominated industry through competence, reliability, and an unshakable calm under pressure. On May 17, 2019, Patricia was hauling manufacturing equipment from Detroit to Denver, a 20-hour drive that she'd broken into 2 days, with an overnight stop planned in Iowa. The route was straightforward. Interstate 80 west all the way, one of the main commercial corridors across the country. Patricia left Detroit at 6 a.m., making excellent time through Michigan and Indiana. By early afternoon, she was crossing into Illinois, ahead of her planned schedule. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, mild temperatures, light traffic. Patricia was listening to an audiobook, enjoying the drive, when her GPS suddenly announced, "Recalculating route. Please proceed to the highlighted alternate route for optimal travel time." Patricia glanced at the GPS screen. The device was showing an alternate route that diverged from I-80 onto what appeared to be a state highway, then through a series of smaller roads before rejoining I-80 about 150 miles west. The GPS claimed the alternate route would save her 47 minutes due to construction delays on the main interstate. Patricia frowned. She hadn't heard any traffic reports about construction on I-80, and her usual AM radio station hadn't mentioned any issues. But the GPS was a top-of-the-line commercial unit, regularly updated with real-time traffic data. Patricia debated for a moment. She generally preferred staying on major highways. They were safer, better maintained, and had more services available. But she was making good time and had some flexibility in her schedule. If the alternate route really would save her nearly an hour, it would give her a comfortable buffer for the overnight stop in Iowa. She decided to trust the GPS and take the alternate route. The exit came up quickly. Illinois State Route 78, heading south. Patricia signaled and took the exit, following the GPS's directions. The state highway was well maintained and had moderate traffic. After about 10 miles, the GPS directed her to turn west onto County Road 47, a smaller 2-lane road that cut through agricultural land. This was more typical of rural Illinois. Endless fields of corn and soybeans, scattered farmhouses, the occasional small town. Patricia drove for 30 minutes on County Road 47, passing through 2 small towns that looked exactly like hundreds of other rural Midwestern communities, grain elevators, farm equipment dealers, small downtown areas with a few shops and a diner. The GPS continued providing directions with its usual confident female voice, directing her through a series of turns onto progressively smaller roads. Patricia started feeling mildly uncomfortable. These roads were getting quite remote, and she hadn't seen another vehicle in almost 15 minutes. She checked the GPS display. According to the map, she was still on course to rejoin I-80 in another hour. The route looked logical on the screen, a series of connected roads that formed a reasonable path west. But something felt wrong. Patricia's instincts, honed by years of long-distance driving, were telling her this didn't make sense. Why would a route through increasingly remote backroads be faster than a major interstate? Patricia decided to call her dispatcher to verify. She picked up her phone. Full signal, no problems there. But when she tried to dial, nothing happened. The call wouldn't connect. She tried again. Same result. She tried calling her husband instead. The phone appeared to be trying to connect, but after several seconds, it would just stop without giving an error message or explanation. Now, genuinely worried, Patricia looked for a place to pull over and reassess. The road she was currently on, according to the last road sign she'd seen, it was County Road 113, ran straight through open farmland, with no shoulder and deep drainage ditches on both sides. Not a safe place to stop. The GPS announced another turn coming up. In 500 feet, turn right onto County Road 89. Patricia slowed down as she approached the intersection. County Road 89 looked even more remote than the road she was on. Narrower, with grass growing in cracks in the asphalt, suggesting it didn't see much traffic. But the GPS was insistent, and Patricia couldn't turn around with her trailer anyway. She made the turn, her truck bouncing slightly as she navigated onto the rougher pavement. County Road 89 ran through an area of denser vegetation, trees pressing close to the road, creating a tunnel-like effect. Patricia noticed that the farms seemed to have disappeared. There were no houses, no barns, no fields, just forest on both sides of the road. That seemed odd for Illinois, which was almost entirely agricultural in these rural areas. She checked her odometer. She'd been on the alternate route for almost an hour now, covering about 50 miles. According to the GPS, she had another 40 miles before rejoining I-80. Then Patricia saw something that made her heart sink. Ahead, on the left side of the road, was a road sign, the kind that indicated an intersection. As she got closer, she could read it. County Road 113, 3 miles. That was impossible. She'd left County Road 113 almost 30 minutes ago. She couldn't be approaching it again unless the roads formed some kind of loop, which the GPS definitely wasn't showing. Patricia passed the sign and continued driving, her anxiety increasing. She was no longer trusting the GPS, but she didn't know what else to do. The road was too narrow and rough to attempt turning around with her trailer, and there were no intersections or side roads appearing where she could safely maneuver. She was committed to following this road wherever it led. 10 minutes later, another sign appeared. County Road 47, 2 miles. Patricia's hands were shaking now. County Road 47 was where she'd started this alternate route over an hour ago. If this sign was correct, she'd driven in a large circle and was heading back toward where she'd begun. But that made no sense with the series of turns she'd made. She should be 40 or 50 miles west of County Road 47, not approaching it again. Patricia grabbed her CB radio, hoping to reach another trucker who might be familiar with the area. "This is Transamerica 6. Anybody copy? I'm on County Road 89 in central Illinois, and I need navigation assistance." No response, not even static. The radio seemed to be working. The power indicator was lit, and she could hear the faint hum of the receiver. But there was no signal at all, as if she was in a complete dead zone. The GPS suddenly spoke again. Recalculating route. Recalculating route. Recalculating route. The voice repeated endlessly, overlapping with itself, creating a disturbing echo effect. Patricia looked at the screen. The map was flickering, showing her position jumping randomly across what appeared to be a web of interconnected roads that hadn't been visible before. The estimated time to destination was changing rapidly. 2 hours, 14 hours, 6 hours, 23 minutes, 9 hours. The numbers spinning wildly. Patricia turned off the GPS, preferring to navigate by instinct rather than follow a malfunctioning device. But even with the power off, the screen remained lit, and the voice continued speaking. Recalculating route. Recalculating route. Please proceed to the highlighted alternate route. Patricia unplugged the unit from its power source. The screen stayed on. The voice continued. That was impossible. Without power, the device shouldn't function at all. Ahead, Patricia saw an intersection with what looked like a larger road. She didn't care what road it was. She was going to turn onto it and follow it until she found civilization, even if it meant driving all the way back to I-80 on back roads. As she approached the intersection, she saw the road signs. The crossroad was identified as Interstate 80. Patricia almost cried with relief. She'd somehow made it back to the main highway. She turned onto the ramp marked I-80 West and accelerated up to highway speeds. The familiar sight of a major interstate was immensely comforting. Proper lanes, clear signage, normal traffic. Patricia saw a truck ahead of her and sped up to catch it, eager to be near another driver. But as she got closer, something seemed off about the truck. It was an older model, maybe from the 1970s or 80s, with styling and proportions that looked outdated. And it was moving strangely, maintaining a perfectly steady speed without the minor variations that real drivers always exhibited. Patricia pulled into the left lane to pass the truck. As she drew alongside it, she glanced over to see the driver. The cab appeared to be empty. No one was behind the wheel. The truck was driving itself, holding a steady course in the right lane, maintaining exactly 55 miles per hour. Patricia accelerated past it, her mind reeling. Maybe she'd just been unable to see the driver from her angle. Maybe it was one of those autonomous vehicle tests. But on a rural interstate in Illinois, that seemed unlikely. More trucks appeared ahead, a whole line of them, all driving in the right lane, all maintaining the same speed, all with that same outdated appearance. Patricia counted 9 trucks, all identical in their behavior. She stayed in the left lane, pulling even with each one as she passed. Every single cab was empty. 9 driverless trucks, moving in perfect formation on a seemingly normal interstate. Patricia looked at the roadside, hoping to see a mile marker or exit sign that would tell her exactly where she was. But the signs that appeared were wrong. They showed exits for towns Patricia had never heard of. Millbrook, exit 147. Shady Brook, exit 159. Riverside Crossing, exit 171. These weren't real Illinois towns, at least none that Patricia knew, and she'd driven through Illinois dozens of times. The overhead highway signs were equally bizarre. One announced, Denver, 2,147 miles. Patricia knew the actual distance from central Illinois to Denver was around 900 miles. Another sign read, Chicago, 47 miles east. But Patricia had left Chicago's metro area hours ago and should be at least 150 miles west of the city by now. The numbers made no sense, as if the signs had been put up randomly with no regard for actual geography. Patricia's fuel gauge, which had been at 3/4 full the last time she checked, was now showing less than a quarter tank. That was impossible. She'd driven maybe 90 miles since leaving I-80, not nearly enough to consume half her fuel. But the gauge was clearly indicating she needed to refuel soon. Up ahead, She saw a blue highway service sign indicating a gas station at the next exit. Patricia took the exit, even though every instinct was screaming at her that something was deeply wrong. She needed fuel, and she needed to call for help. The exit ramp led to a small gas station that looked normal enough. A standard truck stop with diesel pumps, a convenience store, and several cars parked out front. Patricia pulled up to a pump, shut off her engine, and climbed down from her cab. The gas station's sign identified it as Wayside Travel Center, which wasn't a brand Patricia recognized. But there were thousands of independent truck stops across the country, so that wasn't particularly unusual. What was unusual was the complete silence. Despite the several cars parked at the fuel pumps and in front of the store, there was no sound, no conversations, no car engines, no music from radios, nothing. Just absolute silence. Patricia walked toward the store entrance. As she got closer, she could see through the windows that there were people inside. Several customers browsing the aisles, someone behind the counter. But none of them were moving. They were frozen in place, like mannequins or statues. Patricia pushed open the door. No chime sounded. She stepped inside. The people were real, not mannequins. She could see the texture of their skin, the individual hairs, the minute details that separated living beings from artificial replicas. But they were completely motionless and silent. A man stood near the coffee station, his hand extended toward a cup, frozen in mid-reach. A woman at the counter was caught with her wallet open, a credit card pinched between her fingers. Two children near the candy aisle were locked in position mid-argument, their faces showing expressions of anger and frustration. "Hello?" Patricia's voice sounded loud in the silent space. "Can anyone hear me?" No response. None of the frozen people even blinked. Patricia approached the woman at the counter, moving slowly, half expecting something to happen. She reached out and gently touched the woman's arm. It felt normal, warm, slightly soft, the texture of skin and fabric. But the woman didn't react. It was as if time had stopped for everyone, except Patricia. Patricia ran out of the store, back to her truck. She climbed into the cab and locked the doors, her breath coming in short gasps. She had to get out of here, had to get back to a real road, a real place, with real people who moved and talked and existed in normal time. She started the engine. It caught immediately. The familiar diesel rumble, the most comforting sound Patricia had ever heard. She pulled away from the gas station without refueling, even though her fuel gauge still showed critically low. She'd rather run out of gas on the road than stay in that frozen, silent place another minute. Patricia got back on what was allegedly I-80 and drove west, pushing her speed up to 70, then 75. The Hua line of driverless trucks had disappeared. The road ahead was completely empty. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, Patricia saw something different ahead. A shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising from pavement, except it was vertical, stretching across the entire highway like a curtain. As Patricia approached it, she realized she could see through it to the other side, where the road looked different, newer, brighter, more real somehow. She didn't slow down. She aimed her truck straight at the shimmer and drove through it. The transition was instantaneous. Patricia felt a brief sensation of pressure, like passing through a membrane. And then she was on the other side. Real I-80. She could tell immediately. The road surface was the familiar weather-worn pavement she'd driven thousands of miles on. The The signs were the standard green highway signs, showing real towns and accurate distances. And there was actual traffic. Cars, trucks, real human drivers visible through windshields. Patricia pulled over at the first rest area she found, parking among dozens of other trucks. She checked her GPS. It was functioning normally again, showing her actual location on I-80 in western Illinois, almost exactly where she should have been if she'd never taken the alternate route. The time on her dashboard clock was 4:47 p.m. She'd entered the alternate route around 2:00 p.m., but according to the clock, only about 90 minutes had passed, when it had felt like hours. Patricia called her dispatcher, and the call went through immediately. She reported a technical issue with her GPS that had caused her to take a brief detour, but she was back en route and would make her planned stop in Iowa on schedule. She didn't mention the impossible roads, the driverless trucks, the frozen gas station, or the shimmer she'd driven through to get back to reality. She knew how it would sound. Patricia made her delivery to Denver without further incident, but she never trusted GPS navigation again. She now uses paper maps and written directions, planning her routes manually before each trip. She's heard stories from other truckers about alternate routes that their GPS systems suggested, routes that took them to strange places where the normal rules didn't apply. Most drivers just laugh off these stories as road fever or exhaustion-induced hallucinations. But Patricia knows better. She knows that somewhere in the vast network of American highways, there are alternate routes that exist in parallel to the real world, places where trucks drive themselves, where people freeze in time, where the laws of geography and physics bend in ways that defy explanation. And she knows that sometimes, despite all precautions, a driver can slip into these alternate routes and have to find their own way back to reality. The GPS unit that led her astray is still in her truck, unplugged and wrapped in a cloth in a storage compartment. She keeps it as a reminder that not all roads lead where they claim, and not all technology should be trusted without question. Patricia still drives commercially, still makes long-distance runs across the country, but she stays on the main routes now, the big interstates, the well-traveled highways where reality remains solid and dependable. Because she learned the hard way that some alternate routes don't just save time, they take you somewhere else entirely, somewhere you might not be able to return from. Story 7. The Way Station. Thomas Garrett had been driving commercial vehicles for 23 years, starting as a local delivery driver before moving into long-haul trucking when he was 30. At 51, he was a veteran of the road, someone younger drivers looked up to for advice and guidance. Thomas drove for Independence Transport, a mid-sized carrier based in Oklahoma, and he primarily ran routes through the Midwest and Southwest. On October 11, 2017, Thomas was hauling agricultural equipment from Kansas City to Phoenix, a route that would take him southwest through Kansas, into the Oklahoma Panhandle, across New Mexico, and into Arizona, roughly 20 hours of driving split across 2 days. Thomas left Kansas City at 5 a.m. on a cool October morning, making good time on Highway 54, southwest through Kansas. The load was heavy but properly balanced, and his truck was handling well. By mid-afternoon, Thomas was approaching the Oklahoma Panhandle, that narrow strip of land that extends westward from the main body of the state. The landscape had transformed into flat prairie, with endless horizons and vast open skies that gave a sense of insignificance to human activity. Thomas liked this region. It was quiet, peaceful, and the roads were generally in good condition with light traffic. Around 3:30 p.m., Thomas saw a sign ahead. Truck Way Station, 2 miles. All commercial vehicles must enter when lights flashing. Thomas groaned slightly. Weigh stations were a necessary part of trucking. States needed to enforce weight limits and safety regulations, but they were time-consuming and sometimes resulted in detailed inspections that could delay a driver for hours. Thomas checked the sign as he got closer. The lights were flashing. The station was open and operational. Thomas signaled and took the exit ramp to the weigh station. The facility looked standard. A large scale built into the roadway, a small building for the inspection officers, covered areas where trucks could be directed for detailed inspections if needed. But something immediately struck Thomas as odd. There were no other trucks there. Usually, weigh stations in active operation had a few vehicles being processed, maybe a truck or two pulled aside for inspection. This station was completely empty except for Thomas's truck. Thomas pulled onto the scale and stopped, waiting for the signal to proceed. He could see the weigh station office through his windshield. The windows reflected the afternoon sun, making it impossible to see inside clearly. After about 30 seconds, a speaker mounted on a pole beside the scale crackled to life. "Driver, please shut off your engine and proceed to the office with your registration and logbook." That was unusual. Normally, weigh stations either waved you through or directed you to a specific bay for inspection. Being called into the office suggested a problem, but Thomas couldn't think of anything wrong with his load or documentation. He shut off the engine, grabbed his paperwork, and climbed down from his cab. The afternoon air was warm but comfortable, with a slight breeze carrying the smell of dry grass from the surrounding prairie. Thomas walked toward the office building, his boots crunching on the gravel. As he got closer, he noticed the building looked older than he'd initially thought. The paint was faded, the windows were dusty, and weeds were growing up through cracks in the concrete walkway. That was strange. State-operated facilities were usually well maintained. Maybe this station was scheduled for renovation. Thomas pulled open the office door and stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by sunlight filtering through dusty windows and a few fluorescent tubes that flickered irregularly. The office had the standard setup: a counter, a few desks with computers, filing cabinets, safety posters on the walls. But everything looked old and worn, and there was a musty smell in the air, like the building hadn't been properly ventilated in a long time. Behind the counter stood a man wearing what appeared to be a DOT officer's uniform: dark pants, light blue shirt, with patches on the shoulders. But the uniform looked wrong somehow, like a costume from a movie rather than actual regulation gear. The officer was probably in his 50s, with grey hair and a weathered face. He smiled at Thomas, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Afternoon, driver," the officer said. "Registration and logbook, please." Thomas handed over the documents. The officer began examining them with exaggerated care, holding each page up to the light, running his finger down columns of numbers, occasionally making small, disapproving sounds. Thomas stood there waiting, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. Through the window behind the counter, he could see his truck sitting on the scale, looking small and vulnerable in the empty weigh station. "Mr. Garrett," the officer said slowly, still looking at the paperwork. "It appears there's a discrepancy with your weight declaration." "A discrepancy?" Thomas was surprised. "I had the load weighed at the shipper. It's within legal limits. According to our scale, you're 3,200 pounds over the declared weight." "That's not possible," Thomas protested. "The equipment was professionally loaded and secured. The weight certificate is right there." The officer looked up at Thomas, and his eyes were strange, too pale, almost colorless. "Are you questioning the accuracy of state equipment, Mr. Garrett?" No, sir. I'm just confused. That's a significant discrepancy. Can I see the scale reading? In due time. First, we need to conduct a full Level 1 inspection of your vehicle. Please return to your truck and open all compartments and the trailer for inspection. Thomas felt his frustration rising, but he knew better than to argue with DOT officers. Challenging them could result in even more detailed inspections and potential fines. Yes, sir. How long do you estimate this will take? As long as necessary to ensure compliance with all federal and state regulations. The officer's smile returned, that same unsettling expression that looked painted on. Safety is our primary concern, Mr. Garrett. Thomas walked back to his truck, pulling his phone out to call his dispatcher and report the delay. But when he looked at his phone, there was no signal. 0 bars. That was unusual, but not impossible in remote areas. Thomas climbed into his cab and grabbed his CB radio. This is Independence 23 at the way station on Highway 54. Anybody copy? Static answered him, the same empty hiss that suggested no other radios were in range. Thomas climbed down and began opening all the external compartments on his truck. Toolboxes, storage compartments, the areas where he kept his emergency equipment and supplies. As he worked, he noticed something strange. The sun hadn't moved. When he'd entered the way station, it had been mid-afternoon, with the sun still relatively high in the western sky. But now, after what must have been at least 20 minutes, the sun was in exactly the same position. The shadows on the ground were identical to when he'd first arrived. Thomas looked around the way station more carefully. The building, which he'd thought was just old and poorly maintained, looked actively decrepit now. Paint peeling in long strips, rust staining the metal trim, cracks spreading across the concrete foundation. The scale he was parked on had weeds growing through it, and the asphalt around it was crumbling and broken. This station looked abandoned, like it hadn't been operational in years. "Excuse me," Thomas called toward the office. "Hello?" No response. Thomas walked back to the office and opened the door. The interior was different now. The desks were covered in a thick layer of dust. The computers were ancient models from the 1980s or 90s, their screens dark and lifeless. The posters on the walls were yellowed and curling, showing safety information and regulations that were decades out of date. But the officer was still there, standing in exactly the same position behind the counter, still holding Thomas's paperwork, still wearing that unsettling smile. "Mr. Garrett, please return to your vehicle and prepare for inspection," he said, his voice unchanged. "This station is abandoned," Thomas said, his voice shaking slightly. "It's not operational. What the hell is going on here?" "Language, Mr. Garrett. I'll have to note your hostility in my report. That's an additional violation." The officer's smile widened impossibly, his mouth stretching further than a human mouth should be able to stretch. Thomas backed out of the office, his heart pounding. This wasn't right. None of this was right. He ran back to his truck, climbed into the cab, and turned the key. The engine turned over but didn't start. Thomas tried again, pumping the accelerator. Nothing. The engine was dead. "No, no, no," Thomas muttered, trying a third time, a fourth time. The truck wouldn't start. Through his windshield, Thomas saw the officer emerge from the building. But he was different now, taller, his proportions wrong, his movements too smooth. Other figures were appearing around the way station, emerging from behind the building, from the inspection bays, even seeming to rise up from the ground itself. They were all wearing the same uniform, all moving with that same unnatural grace, all converging on Thomas's truck. Thomas locked his doors and tried the engine again. The starter motor ground uselessly. He looked at his side mirrors. The figures were surrounding his truck, at least a dozen of them, maybe more. They reached out and placed their hands on the trailer, on the cab, on the wheels. The truck started shaking, vibrating with an intensity that rattled Thomas's teeth. Thomas closed his eyes and did something he hadn't done since childhood. He prayed. He didn't know who or what he was praying to, but he spoke out loud, his voice steady despite his terror. I am Thomas Garrett. I am a real person driving a real truck on a real highway. I have a wife named Sandra and 2 daughters named Michelle and Lauren. I am not staying here. I am leaving this place and continuing to Phoenix to deliver my load. This place has no power over me. He opened his eyes and turned the key. The engine roared to life immediately. Thomas didn't hesitate. He threw the truck into gear and drove forward, off the scale, straight toward the exit ramp back to the highway. The figures tried to block his path, but when his truck made contact with them, they dissolved like smoke, offering no resistance. Thomas accelerated up the ramp, his trailer swaying slightly as he pushed the speed faster than was safe for the curve. When Thomas reached the highway, he looked in his mirrors. The way station was gone. Where it had been, there was only empty prairie, with no sign that any structure had ever existed there. The highway stretched clear and empty in both directions. Thomas's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the wheel. He pulled over onto the shoulder and sat there, engine idling, trying to catch his breath. After 10 minutes, Thomas got back on the road and continued toward Phoenix. Every time he passed a way station for the rest of that trip, his heart rate spiked, but they all appeared normal. Modern facilities with other trucks and real officers conducting routine inspections. Thomas never saw that abandoned station again, but he researched it later, looking for any information about a way station on Highway 54 in the Oklahoma Panhandle. He found an old news article from 1974. A way station in that approximate area had been the site of a tragedy. An inspection officer had been killed when a driver, angry about a citation, had deliberately run him down with his truck. The station had been closed shortly after, deemed to have bad associations that affected employee morale. The structure had been demolished in 1976. But according to multiple reports from truckers over the years, the station occasionally reappeared, lights flashing, directing trucks to pull in for inspections that never ended. Thomas reported his experience to Independence Transport, framing it as a psychological episode that he attributed to fatigue. The company required him to take a week off and submit to a medical evaluation before returning to duty. Thomas passed all the tests and returned to driving, but he changed his routes to avoid that stretch of Highway 54. He's heard from other drivers who've encountered the phantom way station. Some managed to escape like he did, but others weren't so fortunate. Those drivers disappeared, their trucks found abandoned on the highway, still full of cargo, with no trace of the drivers themselves. Thomas keeps a small note card taped to his dashboard, with his name, his wife's name, and his daughter's names written on it. It's a reminder of who he is and what's real. He's learned that some places on the highway exist in a state between operation and abandonment, between past and present. They appear to unwary drivers, lights flashing, looking official and legitimate. But they're traps, echoes of places that once existed, hunting for vehicles and drivers to add to their eternal collection. Thomas drives carefully now, always aware that the roads hold more than just asphalt and paint, more than just destinations and distances. They hold memories of tragedy, And sometimes those memories reach out to create new tragedies, continuing cycles that should have ended decades ago. Story 8. The Radio Broadcast. Kevin Martinez had been driving team operations for Continental Haulers for 7 years, usually running routes with his regular partner, James Sullivan. Team driving involved 2 drivers operating the same truck in shifts, allowing the vehicle to move almost continuously and significantly reducing delivery times. Kevin was 34 and James was 41, and over the years they'd developed the easy camaraderie that came from spending days at a time together in a confined space. On December 19th, 2021, Kevin and James were hauling holiday merchandise from Los Angeles to Chicago, a route that would take them northeast through Arizona, New Mexico, across Texas, Oklahoma, and into Illinois. Approximately 38 hours of driving that they'd split across 2 days. James had taken the first shift, driving through the afternoon and evening from Los Angeles. Around 11 p.m., they were crossing into New Mexico on Interstate 40, and it was time to switch drivers. James pulled into a rest area east of Gallup, and they made the transition, James climbing into the sleeper berth for his rest period, Kevin taking over the driver's seat. The night was clear and cold, with temperatures in the low 30s. Kevin started the truck and pulled back onto the highway, settling in for his 6-hour shift that would take them through New Mexico and into the Texas Panhandle. Kevin preferred night driving. The highways were less crowded, the driving was easier, and he enjoyed the solitude and the way headlights cut through the darkness. He had his thermos of coffee, his playlist of country music, and the quiet satisfaction of steady miles clicking away. Behind him in the sleeper berth, James was already snoring softly, exhausted from his shift. Around 1:30 a.m., Kevin's music player ran out of charge. Rather than dig through his bag for the charging cable, Kevin decided to just listen to the radio for a while. He switched on the AM/FM receiver and began scanning through stations. This part of New Mexico was remote, and AM stations carried farther at night, so Kevin found several options: country music, classic rock, a Spanish-language station, and several religious broadcasters. He settled on a classic rock station that was playing a song he recognized. The song ended, and a DJ came on with a smooth, professional voice. "You're listening to KWDS 98.7 FM, your companion through the long night. Time is 1:37 a.m. on this Wednesday morning, December 19th. Temperature outside is 31 degrees. We've got a special broadcast for you tonight, dedicated to all you truckers out there on the highway, keeping America moving while most folks are home sleeping. This next set is especially for you." Kevin smiled. Radio DJs who specifically acknowledged truckers always made him feel seen and appreciated. The next song started, another classic rock tune from the 1970s. Kevin sipped his coffee and watched the highway unfold in his headlights. The road was almost empty, with maybe 1 or 2 vehicles visible in the distance every few minutes. The song ended, and the DJ came back on. That was for Kevin Martinez, driving eastbound on I-40 near mile marker 89, hauling holiday merchandise to Chicago. Hope you're staying alert out there, Kevin. Long way still to go. Kevin's coffee cup slipped from his hand, splattering coffee across the cab. The DJ had just said his name, his full name, and his specific location and cargo. Kevin grabbed his CB radio, checking if he'd accidentally left it on a channel where he might have been broadcasting information, but the CB was off. He looked at his phone. It was sitting in the center console, screen dark. There was no way the radio DJ could have known who Kevin was or what he was doing. The DJ continued. Got some requests coming in tonight. Next one is for James Sullivan, currently sleeping in the berth. James, your wife called in to say she loves you, and she'll see you when you get home for Christmas. This one's for you. Kevin's heart was pounding now. James's wife didn't know they were listening to this station. Hell, Kevin hadn't known he'd be listening to this station 5 minutes ago. He'd randomly selected it while scanning through frequencies. This was impossible. Kevin reached over and shook James awake. James, man, wake up. You need to hear this. James groaned and sat up, groggy and confused. What's wrong? Are we there already? Just listen to the radio, Kevin said, turning up the volume. The song was playing, something Kevin vaguely recognized from the 80s. James rubbed his eyes and listened. Okay, it's a radio station. So what? Just wait, Kevin said. Something weird is happening. The song ended. The DJ's voice returned, and Kevin felt vindicated when he heard the words. That was for James Sullivan. James, I know Kevin just woke you up, and you're thinking he's crazy, but he's not. You're both listening to KWDS, the station that knows its listeners. We're here for you, all through the night, all along your route. We'll be with you all the way to Chicago. James was fully awake now, his face pale. How does he know our names? How does he know where we're going? I don't know, man. It started a few minutes ago. He's been saying specific things about us. James reached for the radio controls. Turn it off. This is some kind of prank or... I don't know, but turn it off. Kevin switched off the radio. Silence filled the cab, except for the rumble of the engine and the hiss of tires on pavement. Both men sat there, processing what had just happened. Maybe it's some kind of new technology, James offered. Like, they track commercial vehicles and personalize broadcasts? That's illegal, Kevin said. And even if it wasn't, how would they get that information in real time? And what about your wife calling in? That was bullshit, right? I don't know, James said slowly. Let me check. He pulled out his phone and called his wife. Kevin could only hear James's side of the conversation, but he gathered that James's wife was very confused about being woken at 1:45 a.m. And no, she hadn't called any radio station. James ended the call and looked at Kevin. She didn't call anybody. This is really fucked up. They drove in silence for several minutes. Kevin kept glancing at the radio, almost expecting it to turn itself back on. The highway remained empty, and the New Mexico darkness pressed close around their bubble of light. Finally, curiosity got the better of James. Turn it back on, he said. I want to hear what it says now. Kevin hesitated, then switched the radio back on. The same station came through immediately, even though Kevin hadn't retuned it. The DJ was in the middle of speaking, and I know you boys turned me off for a few minutes. That's okay, I understand. This is unusual for you. But you're going to want to keep listening, because I've got important information about your route ahead. James and Kevin looked at each other in horror. The DJ had known they'd turned off the radio. He was somehow aware of their actions inside the cab. Kevin's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Maybe we should pull over, he said. Call the dispatcher or the police or someone. And tell them what? James asked. That a radio DJ knows our names? They'll think we're crazy. The DJ continued. In approximately 17 miles, you're going to see a rest area on the right side. Don't stop there. Keep driving. That rest area isn't safe for you tonight. Fuck this, James said, reaching for the radio to turn it off again. Wait, Kevin said, grabbing his arm. What if he's right? What if there really is something dangerous at that rest area? You're seriously going to take advice from a haunted radio station? I don't know what this is, but yeah, I'm not stopping at that rest area. Are you? James thought for a moment, then shook his head. No, I'm not. They drove on, counting down the miles. At mile marker 106, exactly 17 miles from where they'd been when the DJ made his warning, a rest area appeared on the right side of the highway. Kevin maintained his speed and drove past it. As they went by, Kevin glanced at the rest area in his mirrors. In the parking lot, he saw multiple vehicles, cars and trucks, but something about them looked wrong. They were all parked at odd angles, as if they'd stopped suddenly or carelessly. And there were no lights on in any of them, no sign of people or movement. The rest area's facilities building was dark, even though rest areas were supposed to be lit for safety. Did you see that? Kevin asked. Yeah, James said quietly. Something's wrong with that place. Maybe the DJ was right. The radio DJ spoke again. Good decision, Kevin. That rest area has been the site of 17 robberies and 3 murders in the past 6 months. Police haven't identified the perpetrators yet. You would have been number 18 and possibly number 4 and 5. You're welcome. Kevin and James sat in stunned silence. Neither of them had heard about any robberies or murders at that rest area, but they were going to look it up as soon as they got reliable internet access. Thank you, Kevin said to the radio, feeling ridiculous talking to an electronic device. Thank you for the warning. You're welcome, Kevin. That's what I'm here for. To help travelers on the highway, to keep them safe. The DJ's voice was warm and friendly, almost paternal. Now, I've got another important message. In about 45 minutes, you're going to encounter a stretch of highway where black ice has formed. It's not visible, and there are no warning signs yet. You'll need to reduce your speed to 45 miles per hour starting at mile marker 134. If you don't, you'll lose control of your vehicle. James will be killed in the resulting crash. Kevin, you'll survive, but spend the rest of your life paralyzed from the waist down. The blood drained from both their faces. The DJ had just described their deaths with the casual precision of someone reading a weather report. How do you know this? James demanded, speaking directly to the radio. What are you? I'm KWDS, 98.7 FM, your companion through the long night. I see all possible outcomes for the travelers who listen to me. I can guide you to the safe paths and warn you away from the dangerous ones. All you have to do is listen and follow my instructions. Kevin and James looked at each other. They were both rational men, experienced truckers who'd driven millions of combined miles. They didn't believe in supernatural radio stations or prophecies, but they couldn't deny what had just happened. The DJ had known things he shouldn't be able to know, and his warning about the rest area had been accurate. The specific details about black ice and the crash seemed impossible. But what if they were true? What do we do? Kevin asked James. I guess we slow down at mile marker 134, James said.